Welcome to EMBARGOED, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I'm one of your hosts, Tim O'Toole, and with me today is my friend, colleague, and co-host, Roland Stein of the Blomstein law firm in Berlin. Roland, welcome to the podcast.
Tim, it's a great pleasure being here. Thank you.
Good to have you. So why don't you tell us a little bit about, first, before we get started on German export controls and talking about the year in German export controls 2022, because I think it might have been the biggest year in the history of German export controls and sanctions. Why don't you tell us first a little bit about your law firm Blomstein and your practice there?
Okay, starting with the law firm. So we are a independent boutique law firm. It's a spin-off from Freshfields, where I and the other founding partners used to work for a number of years. But already in 2016, so seems to be ages ago, we set up our own law firm, and we're very focused on international trade, public procurement law, and antitrust. So really the regulation of competition and of trade on an international level. And I think we're now around 20 lawyers and focusing on these areas. If you look, I think of greater interest today is the international trade sector. And it's certainly true that we've had, I guess, the most spectacular year, and not only positively, but certainly most of that, if we think of the origin, that's certainly a horrible origin of all these, all these disputes and conflicts that we have that led to these legal activities throughout the world, including in Europe and in Germany. And if we look at, I think all trade areas have been affected by the war in Ukraine, but also by disputes with China and disruptions in Iran, in Myanmar, wherever, and all these conflicts have had an impact on the legislation in Europe and in Germany. If you look at the Russia sanctions alone, I think the starting point was the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and there we had a regulation consisting of 6 pages, and now we have more than 60 pages, including more than 30 annexes of the Russia sanctions, and then in addition to that, we still have the financial sanctions. On the financial sanctions, it was exploded from I think less than 100 people sanctioned to more than 1,000, so really more than 10
Wow.
times the amount of people sanctioned. I think if you look at the industry in Russia, it's certainly easier to find sectors which have not been targeted, right? So we thought about that. We had a coffee here in the morning in the office, and I think it's fair to say that if you look at the imports from Russia, you can still import agricultural products and certain raw materials. So nickel, palladium, copper, stuff that really is only produced basically in Russia, right?
Right.
And then on the export side, you have pharmaceutical products. But even in these little areas, you also have encroachments and hamperings, because you hardly find a bank to finance that. You have, all sorts of prohibitions on brokering, on technical assistance. So I think it's really basically the entire trade in products, in goods, in services with Russia has been hampered. And that's certainly to a country such as Germany, which is so much oriented into exporting stuff. So that's really, it was a nightmare to the industry, and was certainly a challenge also here on our side.
Yeah, it's been a big year, and I think if I had to pick one country that has responded to the war in Ukraine in a way that was different than predicted, I would say Germany would be the country that I would pick. And part of the reason, and I'll let you talk a little bit more about this, but just from the outside, I think the expectation seemed to be that because Germany and Russia were such extensive trading partners, and because the sanctions that took place after Crimea, particularly with respect to Germany, seemed relatively minimal, and even the ones that were in place, from the U.S. perspective anyway, Germany didn't seem inclined to go along with them. And I think that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was probably a good example of that. And then after the war began, I think the German sanctions have changed more than any other country's sanctions, at least from the outside. It looks that way. I mean, and I'll throw it over to you at this point, but I mean, why don't you provide us a little history of kind of who the regulators were? And at least as I understand it, in the last year, the German law has changed pretty dramatically in terms of how the statutory authority for sanctions and how sanctions work and export controls work within Germany itself.
Yeah, I think if you allow me to go back a bit further, so I think the tradition of the German industry investing in Russia goes back way a long time. So, if you look at Siemens, for example, and it was when it's still a time when the company wasn't that big. So the first big international contract that Mr. Siemens, I think himself, was awarded was building, telegraphic I think lines in Russia. And since
Wow.
then, there was a long tradition of German companies investing in Russia, in the energy market, in the energy field, in the telecommunications sector, in the agricultural sector. So this was really a part of uh, the German export market. I think not always the most important one, but certainly a important market. And what is also important to bear in mind that this market was still there during the Soviet times, right? So we had a system that I fear of saying that this was I won't qualify it, right, with regard to
Right.
today's Russia's political system, but at least it was considered to be very bad from a Western experience how the Soviet Union was run. But still, you had industries operating in Soviet Union and buying natural gas, coal, and oil from the Soviet Union. And so I think there, it's probably, if you look at it from that perspective, it's clear that Germany had an interest in continue buying natural gas from Russia through Nord Stream 1 and 2. And so the politicians here, but also, the mainstream business, people always said, yeah, sure, we want to continue buying. And then there was this bang in the which happened on 24 February of last year. One could have thought, okay, the first bang should have been annexation of Crimea or the invasion of Russia in Georgia, but these didn't really. I think this was still considered to be far away, and you always had, I wouldn't say an understanding, but I think it wasn't. It wasn't to be perceived as harsh as what happened then when Russia invaded a European country for the first time since the Second World War. We had such activities here in Europe. And I think this really was considered to be a massive change. And I think the way in which politicians consider Russia changed, but also the way in which business leaders consider Russia changed. So I think we've had a number of discussions in which we told our clients, so these are the rules. You need to do A, B, and C, and you are precluded from doing D, E, F. And they said, okay, but I want to do more. I want to divest quicker. I want to stop selling altogether, even if I was still allowed to sell these products to Russia. A number of companies decided that they will not want it. They just felt that they are morally obliged to stop trading with Russia.
And
Um,
just to jump in here, I mean, I've seen the same thing from the U.S. side. I mean, I've represented as you know, I've represented German clients for years in the export and sanction space. And I think prior to February 2022, what I would get was that whatever export controls or sanctions were in place were kind of a nuisance from the U.S. side. Like complying with U.S. sanctions and U.S. export controls was a nuisance and something that they weren't really was not a priority. Post February 2022, I mean, we have clients now who want updates on U.S. sanctions, German clients who never seemed interested in those sanctions before, want updates on export controls, want to know kind of how do I go through compliance in a way that just hadn't happened prior to February 2022. So I'm even, it sounds like that's even more, um, there's even more energy for that just on the German side, but even for German companies complying with U.S. laws, it's just, it's like nothing I've ever seen before.
Yeah, and I think one interesting topic, a related topic, I think if you look at this, if we look away, moving away from the companies back to the legislator, I think this is the first time that we've seen the EU acting more aggressively than the US regulator. So I think it used to be, and you remember that from past cases, and this was always very easy for us. So we asked our dear US colleagues to tell us, how are the rules in the US, and then we simply told the client, these are the rules in the US. They prohibit like 80%, and then we told them these are the rules in the EU, so we only prohibit like 10%, right?
Yep.
And I think now you have a situation in which all of a sudden the EU is much stricter than, I think in some areas the EU adopted the US approach. For example, when we do it as in the US, that you add the participation of sanctioned persons, and if the overall participation of a sanctioned person in another company is over 50%, then this other company is considered to be a sanctioned person as well, right? So I think that this used to be the case in the US, but in the EU it was always that you looked at that separately. But now, so I think, with regard to owner control, I think we basically followed the stricter standard that was being adopted in the US. But if you look at certain areas, I think now the EU, decided to be more aggressive than US. For example, with regard to the export of luxury products,
Yep.
Or the export of certain industrial components that are still allowed from a US perspective, but are prohibited from an EU perspective.
The values are very different. I mean, from the U.S. side, the value for a luxury good is usually over $1,000 per good, and I think the EU is 300 euros or something
Yeah.
along those lines, and so it's a lot less in the EU, so it catches a lot more goods.
Yeah, and if you in addition take into account that you had a lot of road export to Russia, right? So which
Yep.
made it easier, and I think these they're just some examples of where I think the EU realized that it needed to take a very strong stance here, and it's not afraid of taking that stance. And I think in all the changes that we've seen, and just counted today in the morning, so we had 15 amendments to the Russia regulation, to the main Russia regulation 833, and 5 corrections, so more than 20 legislative steps, starting with 23 February. And with all of them, the rules always got harder. So I think there isn't one change here which made it easier to export to Russia. Sometimes they deleted a listing from one of the annexes, but it was clear that we had some clients that are active in the pharma sector, so it was clear that these products are used exclusively to heal people, right? And then you had instances where this one line was crossed out of the sanctions list. So we've had cases like this, but the systematic approach was always getting tougher and tougher and tougher. Which makes it now more complex, right? I mean, we're discussing
Right.
the 10th package, right?
Yeah. Is that coming out in the next couple of weeks? That's what I've heard.
Well, I don't know. It was supposed to come out some weeks ago, and then it was supposed to. Now it's the idea is to have it as a present to the 24th of February, so the year of the proper invasion.
Wow.
But we have the black box of certain Eastern European member states, in particular Hungary, which are opposing some of these of the potential areas. And if you look, what you can still can do is there are still some banks operating which are not sanctioned. So Alpha Bank, for example,
Right.
such a bank could be added to the list. You have certain sectors such as the civil nuclear sector, so Rosatom, that could be sanctioned. Um, but there, Hungary, and I think in that regard, understandably says, okay, but we're just commissioned them to build a nuclear plant in Hungary, right? What
Right.
are we expected to do that? And so I think, you tell us we should stop buying coal, we should stop buying natural gas, and now we'll have this nuclear plant, and now we're not allowed to continue building that. So I think
Is
there are
there
always,
some way? Is there some way to grandfather that through a general license? I mean, the OFAC does that from time to time, where there's a project that it doesn't want to interfere with, but basically wants to impose sanctions going forward. But
yeah, I
maybe
think
the
we've seen these cases. So, for example, in the crude oil sector,
uh-huh.
so I don't know when, but I think it was in late summer. So crude oil and some of the oil products were added to the sanctions list. And there we have a multi-step approach. So first, it was only, if you had oil that came from pipelines, this was still allowed to be imported, which I think makes sense if you look at we have some landlocked countries, Bulgaria, for example, and they have their pipelines coming from Russia. So, where should they buy their oil from if not from Russia, right?
Right.
So I think the idea was first that you had the transports by sea, which were prohibited, but then you had grandfathering clauses, for example, for certain activities or for on-the-spot acquisitions until I think it was December and February of this year. But most of these grandfathering clauses have elapsed now
Okay.
with regard to crude oil. But you could certainly consider also having grandfathering clauses in the civil nuclear area. And I guess that would be a price that certainly not certainly, but I think the Commission would pay this price of allowing Hungary to continue cooperating with Rosatom to have a 10th package.
Yeah.
But
That'll be interesting to see.
yeah,
It's pretty amazing that the EU has gotten through 9 packages, given that my understanding is you need all 30 member states to go along with it, and getting unanimity like that has been quite
yes,
impressive.
getting in, and it's really difficult. I mean, I think you have some countries such as Poland and the Baltic states, which have a very clear pro-Ukrainian position, and so they support all the um, sanctions. But then you have countries such as Hungary and Bulgaria, which have a immense not dependency, but they have very strong economic ties to Russia
Right.
and bought a lot of their natural gas, coal, and all these other raw materials from Russia. And if you look at Germany, it's probably in a better situation. It used to buy a lot of its natural gas from Russia, but given the economic power, it was able to simply buy the natural gas from other sources, right?
Right.
But some of the Eastern European states simply don't have the economic resources to go on and buy everything at all costs,
Right.
right? So I think
Right.
it's really I think it's an impressive political achievement from the EU Commission and the Council that they managed to pass on all these packages without huge discussion. Some of them took longer than expected, but at the end of the day, we've seen really substantial number of very aggressive sanctions packages here.
Yeah, do you think it has anything to do with the U.S. approach here? I mean, and it may be that this would have happened organically anyway, but I've always thought that it helped that the U.S. basically said to its allies, "We'll handle U.S. transactions, and you're responsible for your own transactions in terms of sanctions." And so, which is completely contrary to the case of, say, Iran, where the U.S. said, we're going to impose sanctions even on transactions that don't have anything to do with us. Even, German transactions with Iran are going to be our business, and we don't care what you think. Whereas with the Russia sanctions, at least after February 2022, the U.S. position has mostly been, certainly with respect to the EU, you are responsible for your sanctions, and so if they're going to be harsh, it's going to be because you make them harsh, and if they're going to be weak, it's going to be because you make them weak. Now, I do think that the U.S. might have changed its approach if the EU had not stepped up like it did, but the way that the EU has stepped up has been incredibly impressive, and I think it actually supports the notion that if you want stronger sanctions, multilateral sanctions are much more effective and much more much easier to get if you bring in a coalition and say everybody stays in its own lane, as opposed to, if you don't do this, we're going to do this, which has been the traditional U.S. approach in the past, at least with respect to Iran.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and it fits well in this European approach of living in a rule-based, harmonized world. I'm not saying that the EU is always abides by its own rules and standards, right? But I think the overall approach, and that's the EU is a concept where we have individual countries moving together, right? So they say we want to have here a harmonized international standard. So I think it was always perceived to be an issue having these secondary sanctions on Iran, but also on Cuba, for example. So it was
Yep.
always perceived to be an issue here in Europe, and it certainly helped. I think it helped that there was at least among the G7, you had some understanding that we need sanctions, but the way this was transposed was certainly helpful to have each region following its own rules. So I concur with you there.
So you mentioned energy when you were talking a little bit. So how have the price caps gone so far from the German perspective, and I guess more from the EU perspective? But is there anything unique about how they've gone from the German perspective?
I think not really. I remember. I think your last podcast was also on the price caps, right?
It was, and so I talked with Sue Millar a little bit about the price caps and the difference between the UK and the US in terms of enforcement and some of the potential legal challenges.
Yeah.
And I think our verdict was that so far we're really not hearing nearly as much as we expected to hear on either side of the Atlantic with respect to the price caps. Perhaps because it's just too soon, and that might be the case with Germany as well. But from the UK perspective, I actually expected to hear more, mostly because the insurance is such a key to the price caps, and the UK is such a leader in the insurance industry. And so, I mean, are any of the industries that are, the maritime services that are affected by the price cap, are those traditional German industries? And do you have clients or companies that are particularly worried about them?
Well, I think you have so you have a number of maritime companies here in Germany, in particular in Hamburg, and also insurance and in particular reinsurance companies.
Yep.
And I think two large reinsurance companies that are also active in that sector. So we haven't seen that many cases here. We had a number of cases with regard to the import of oil, particularly with regard to spot purchases and ways in which you could assess whether the oil was of Russian origin or not, right? And all of a sudden you had a proposal from someone in Bulgaria offering very good oil. So we had a number of cases in this area, but with regard to the price cap, we haven't seen it. And I think, I mean, the rules seem to be pretty straightforward.
Yep.
Um, but then I don't know. I mean, if you look at that, the price cap is oriented to deal with transactions between Russia and third states. That happens all far away on the oceans. So I think I I have the fear that there might be a lot of circumvention going on there. I mean,
Yeah, I think that that's where it's going to be hard to police because I think they set out this tier one, tier two, tier three, but the tier two and tier three are the insurance companies, reinsurance companies, the companies that are not on the ground actually buying the oil, so they're not going to be able to tell you what price it is, and so their information is only going to be good as what's provided kind of on the first exit from Russia, and that I suspect that you're going to have to really look closely at documents and try and figure out whether they're genuine. But still, how would you know? I mean,
yeah, I
unless
think that's a good point. And if you look at our work as a lawyer, so I think first starting in February it was advising on the new rules, right? So trying to
right,
understand and in calls with companies which didn't understand the rules and understandably, because sometimes they're simply not
right,
understandable, right?
right,
And then, but what started in the summer and autumn, definitely of last year, were first cases where there were some violations. So I think most of them, unintentional cases of violations. So we found a number of self-disclosures. Um, um, and then we've seen a number of cases already in which authorities are, looking into certain transactions, assessing whether they have been, whether they, are prohibited under the sanctions rules. And we've seen a number of cases in which the press reported about companies breaching sanctions, allegedly breaching sanctions. So, and I think this latter part, so self-disclosures and investigation dawn rates, that's the part where we see more and more activity now.
yep,
So I could imagine that these tier 2 and 3 operators will be targeted, in 2 years' time,
you're
when
right.
there is
It'll
an
take a while.
export trade audit, and all of a sudden you will have an auditor, and it's so much easier to, after 2 years' time, say, "Oh, you should have known that this was Russian oil, right?" I mean,
Exactly.
people are very smart.
Right.
If
With
you look
hindsight, it's
exactly,
2020.
exactly. So, and I think then we will have the discussions. Was it really was the $60 the contract price, or wasn't it a $120 price, and because the surcharge wasn't new or whatever, right? I think
Right.
all these
Right.
additions and subtractions that you can have from the price, that will certainly play a role way down the road.
Understood. So my sense from the outside is that um, I think you mentioned some enforcement actions already. Is that the German enforcement agencies have been pretty aggressive? I mean, is that your sense too, or is this just kind of spotlighting a couple of high-profile incidents?
No, I think, um, and that goes back to what you said at the very beginning, that the way in which German authorities and German business are dealing with this matter is completely different than what it used to be in the past, dealing with other trade sanctions. I think most companies always said, okay, we need to abide by these rules, but they were really perceived to be oh my God, do I really need to abide by these rules, right? I mean, they preclude me from doing nice business. But now you have a urgent sense to abide by the rules. And you see that at company level, but also at authority level. And you have a number of very serious public prosecutors that are cracking down, that are looking into every ways of looking into certain transactions. We've seen a number of whistleblower cases in which employees or former employees of the company went to the prosecutor and said, my former employer is selling stuff to Russia and he shouldn't be doing. Um, we also had such a case where the whistleblower turned out to be, not saying the truth, right? Because at the end of the day,
That will happen
that will
sometimes.
happen, yes, and it happened in that case already, where we had really it was it was a fake news, right? I mean,
Right,
the
exactly.
company was all right. They had a nice compliance system, stopped selling to Russia, but I think it's easy now to make news and to end up in the news. And what you certainly don't want as a company is to be involved with Russia's sanctions violations and be named in the press, right?
Right,
So that's
right.
always something that, in addition to our legal advice, what companies will always look for is to consider what the implications will be on the media side.
Yep. I mean, it really is an area, and this is true from the US side as well, where companies are not only concerned about kind of staying on the right side of sanctions, but being perceived to be on the right side of these sanctions,
Yeah,
which, obviously companies would rather have good publicity rather than bad publicity. But I think I've written more memos on the reputational consequences of doing something than I probably in the last year than I probably had in the 10 years before that.
that's right, and I think I think understanding the sanctions regulations is already hard sometimes, right? I
Yep.
mean, even if you have dealt with sanctions rules before, but they're always a novel concept, and I think we have a number of novel issues also in these sanctions, but they're technically quite heavy. And then you have all the classification issues. So does a product really fall under Annex 7 or 8 or 18 or whatever? Um, but then you have this reputational issue where it's really difficult to predict, is it really going to be an issue if I exported, I don't know, butter to Russia, and all of a sudden there is a journalist which says that exporting butter to Russia is the worst thing you can do in your life, right?
Exactly. You can pretty much guarantee it.
Yeah.
Um, so in terms of keeping up with the law, which I think that is kind of a consequence of all these changes, but also kind of a more active enforcement authority. I mean, so my understanding is that prior to the last year, that the German authorities did not put out a lot of guidance. But in the last year, a lot of guidance has come out. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how that process has worked? Because I think we've gotten pretty used to the guidance coming out on over in the U.S. with OFAC. OFAC has gotten better over time in figuring out which questions really are frequently asked and providing answers to them if it can. How is that going from the perspective of the BAFA and BaFin?
I think it's getting better. So we have now FAQs from the European Commission and from the German Ministry for Economic Affairs, and you have some leaflets from BAFA. So I think in that regard, I think there is a constant revision also of the positions taken. So, for example, with regard to the luxury goods we're speaking about, how do you calculate the value of these goods, right? And there was some discrepancy, and I think now they solved that and said basically you have to look into the export documents. So, which was I think it was a good result, but it
Right.
took some time for it to dribble down into the FAQs. So I think that's getting better. What is somehow difficult here is approaching authorities on individual cases, and I think this was always very not a USP, was certainly a good point of exporting from Germany, because the German authorities were always harsh on their interpretation of the law. So it wasn't that you could negotiate a lot with them about saying, okay, we export A and you prohibit B, right? This was never their approach. But you could always ask them for their opinion, and they would provide you the answer. And that's still true. However, I think because in some areas the legislation is so unclear, because I think sometimes the packages, they were adopted within days, right? So I think it
Yep.
really makes it difficult for them as well to understand what's written in there, and you have a lot of pressure, political pressure to crack down on violators. But then you also have naturally a pressure from the business, right? Because they want to abide by the rules, but they also want to continue doing legal businesses. And you have a situation in which you now have thousands of applications per week, where you used to have, I don't know, 10 or 20, right? So
Yep.
I think this mixture really made it difficult for the authorities to be able to really respond precisely on what on the questions we put to them. And what we have seen, unfortunately, more than once is an answer saying, "Oh, we understand your position, and I think it's fair to say that your arguments are okay. However, it remains a bit unclear, and so we recommend you not to do this." And that's really the worst that can happen, right? Because
Well, I knew it was unclear when I asked.
exactly, right?
Your job was to tell me the answer.
Exactly. And I think because then it's really impossible for the company to continue doing the business. So I think
Right.
it's more developing into an area in which more and more often we do not reach out to authorities. Rather, we say, okay, that's our understanding. That's the risk analysis. But in our opinion, you're good to go, right? And then the
Right.
companies have a hopefully solid legal foundation to
Right.
move on with the business. And in case they're audited in 2 years' time, they can always blame me then, right? Uh,
Right. That's
but
our job, right?
exactly, that's my job, and so I hope that we'll go back to being able to discuss more open and more often with authorities as it used to be before the Russian invasion.
Yeah, that is unfortunate. I mean, but that is so. So we actually have kind of both versions of that over here. So on the one hand, the Commerce Department, which deals with the items that are subject to U.S. export controls here, is actually pretty good about talking to you and helping you resolve things in a pretty quick way. OFAC is not nearly as good, and in fact, it has been suggested that OFAC has had a policy of strategic ambiguity, meaning they're ambiguous and they kind of don't want you to know the answer because their hope is that if you can't figure out the answer, you won't do the transaction, and so they'll stop even more transactions than they've prohibited if they keep things ambiguous. Whereas if they provide clarity, then people will get right up to the line. And I think that sounds like where Germany's at, but I think what you're talking about after that is what's happened here as well, where essentially because you'll never get an answer out of OFAC, it's kind of left to the sanctions bar to figure this out without any help from the regulators, which is a lot harder, but essentially kind of puts us at like we have to call it and then say, we could be wrong, but we this is our best this
Yeah,
is our best estimate of what is allowed and what's not. And if follow our advice, there's still some risk, but here's why we think the risk is X, or why we think the risk is higher than X. But it becomes a risk analysis because essentially you wind up telling them, here's what I think the law is, but there's no guarantees because we can't get any clarity from OFAC.
yeah, yeah. I think that's where we were heading. I would say that I wouldn't say that the reason for their ambiguity is because that's a purposeful. And I guess OFAC would never admit of doing
No, OFAC does not admit to strategic
exactly.
ambiguity.
But I think I guess it's more a question of just being overwhelmed. And in addition to that, BAFA is not only competent of dealing with export sanctions, but also there the authority, dealing with state aids in the area of electricity, of gas. So they had to deal with all these state aid schemes during the February, March type. So they really had a lot of work in their agenda. And then a number of agents that were dealing with export control matters, they were dragged on to other departments dealing with the state aid issues. Because and there was, certainly was I presume there was a political decision to say, okay, we need to save the German economy from collapsing because the energy prices are so high. So we need to really get the money to the companies as quickly as possible. And this was perceived to be less of an issue of dealing with complicated export control matters because of companies wanted to export to Russia. So I think the ambiguity was more of you had less people to deal with more complex questions.
Yep.
You had more people dealing with just getting the money to
Right. Getting money moving.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. So my understanding is in the past year that Germany has also passed 2 new sanctions laws. I mean, pretty groundbreaking sanctions laws, and different, at least as I understand, than anything that's really come before. Can you talk about both of those quickly and kind of how that's affected German sanctions law and practice?
Yeah, I think we're not seeing. Oh, I think we're not seeing the results yet of these new sanctions enforcement acts. But I think the rules that are being set now will really change the way in which sanctions are imposed. But perhaps if I can start at the EU level,
Sure.
you always have, I think the material prohibitions are set by the EU legislator, which says, okay, it's prohibited to sell, arms to Russia. And then there is always a clause in the regulation saying member states must provide for penalties for cases of breaches. And that's in, I guess, all sanctions regulations. And then in each individual member state, you need to have a legislation saying it's prohibited to sell arms either to Russia or simply referring to the regulation at EU level. And Germany has been doing that, and in all other or most other member states have been doing that throughout the history. So you will have prohibitions being sanctioned at member state level throughout the EU. The way they deal with these enforcement cases is different. So in some countries it's a criminal offense, in others it's an administrative offense. In other countries you have a mixture, depending on whether it was intentional or negligent. So I think there you have a different setup. And then you have 2 developments. At EU level, the EU is trying to strengthen the way that member states need to deal with the sanctions. So they're saying you need to provide for stronger rules. For example, and this is something that will probably lead to changes in German legislation, you also need to provide for criminal offenses, I guess, for cases of non-intentional behavior. So someone acted negligently. This may lead to a criminal offense throughout the EU. So that's not this regulation is still being discussed, but it could have major impact throughout the EU. So that's a discussion at EU level. And then in Germany, we've had an understanding that we had all these beautiful rules at EU level, but the way they were being imposed in Germany was perceived to be weak. For example, it was unclear, what prosecutor is competent to deal with a big boat that is allegedly owned by one of the Russian guys, the rich guys, and you didn't know, was it his boat? Is it the prosecutor A or B who's competent? Is it, the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Economic Affairs? So there was because there isn't such a huge history, such as in the US, of going after sanctions violations. There wasn't a lot of practice to build on.
Yeah.
So, and there, what started was to have a task force being built up in the Ministry for Economic Affairs that is really bundling the knowledge and competencies from other ministries and from within the Ministry for Economic Affairs, and thinking about issues such as the Sanctions Enforcement Act. So I think, and this was really, I think, perhaps even more important than to have this new legislation is to have the understanding at the federal level. We need to have a think tank at federal level dealing with information, dealing with sanctions enforcement matters. So I think this was really a major change, because before that it was like, okay, it's for each prosecutor dealing with that, but to have central body dealing with that, I think this was really a key. And what we have in these individual acts, I think the first one was more of an organizational one, dealing with who's competent for what. So I think an important inner governmental issue. And the second will really be, putting this information into the right place. So there is a central office for sanctions enforcement, which will be created. And the idea is here to channel information on sanctions enforcement and AML into the central office. This office's job will be to set up a central register where you will have a number of information, in particular, is asset A owned by a sanctioned individual? And that's an information that nowadays isn't available, right?
Right.
And then you will have, once you have the information on who is sanctioned, what property is blocked. So I think this could really be a game changer. Now, what is not dealt with in this regulation is what happens with these frozen assets. As everywhere, there is also a discussion here about expropriating these assets and using them to rebuild Ukraine. I guess constitutionally this will be a major challenge, because so far, also in Germany, but I think across the EU, the idea is that asset freezes are a temporary activity, and the assets need to be given back once.
Right. It's to change behavior, and when behavior changes, you give the assets back. Has been the philosophy over here as well.
Yeah.
But that has changed in connection with this war, where our Congress passed a law in December that allowed the Justice Department to transfer certain forfeited assets, to the proceeds to Ukraine. And that is new because the forfeited assets either had to go to the Treasury, or there were certain victims groups that they could go to, but they couldn't be transferred to another country. And so that's changed. What hasn't changed, though, at least from the state side, is that OFAC can freeze assets, but OFAC doesn't forfeit assets. DOJ forfeits assets, and there's actually a judicial process that you have to go through, and they have to prove certain things in a civil case or potentially a criminal case. But there's actually a court process. I mean, is there something similar in Germany, or is that part of what the new sanctions laws have put in place?
That's presumably not exactly the same, but it's procedurally a nightmare. But
yes, here too.
Yeah, but you can only forfeit property if there is a judicial decision backing that. So I think you can, so the prosecutor can, for example, ask for a real estate property just to be frozen, right? So there is in the register, you will have a stamp saying frozen by the prosecutor. But if he wants to make use of that, so to forfeit it, to sell it to third parties, then he needs to go to the court. And the court will say, yes, it's a criminal activity, and that's why you, state, are allowed to sell it. and I guess this could be a major challenge in with regard to Russia sanctions, because while I think it's clear for some of the companies or persons listed there that they're probably not extremely nice persons, but the question is, have they really been individually involved in criminal activities, right?
Right. Right. And that's going to be the issue here in the states too. I mean, at least our media in the states talks about these forfeiture issues and talks about the klepto capture task force as though they're just going to magically take these assets, sell them, and hand them to Ukraine. It's just a matter of can we get our hands on them. But there's actually, I mean, there's a real process here, and there are things you have to prove that are very different than what gets people sanctioned. And
Yeah.
so I'm curious to see how that plays out. We've only had one forfeiture case here so far, and it wasn't contested. But some of these cases, I suspect, will be contested, and if they are contested, it's not just like magic. It's not just
Yeah.
the prosecutor says this is a Russian oligarch's property, so therefore we sell it and we send it to Ukraine. The standards are a little different.
Yeah, and I think you have the constitutional law issues, which certainly are, legally extremely interesting, or what can say challenging, right? I mean, the law develops also with these disputes, right? So the Nuremberg
Yep.
trials also led to a development of the law, which was different, right? And I think
Right.
you always have these conflicts which can lead to a change of legislation or of the law. I think if you look at it from a policy perspective, I think you can always also make an argument to say, okay, if we really, take their money, right, to make it bluntly, uh, are we really making sure that in the next case we can use sanctions in the same way, right? Because we want people to go back to being civilized persons again, right? To coming
Yes.
to being businesses would want to trade worldwide. And if we take away the money, then it's clear that the sanction is a punishment.
Well, and yeah, it's totally a punishment, and it's not even clear with respect to what the media would call Russian oligarchs what the point of the punishment is. I understand the sanctions rationale for this. The sanctions rationale is we want to put pressure on Putin to change his policy and end the war in Ukraine. And the most wealthy Russian executives are people who will likely have influence and power over Putin because they control significant portions of the Russian economy. And so if we make life difficult for them, maybe they'll go back and say to Putin, stop. Right? That's the theory. And so but if you essentially take you don't just make life difficult. You essentially take away any incentive they have to go back to Putin because the property's gone. It's actually been sold and sent over to Ukraine. You don't have those sorts of incentives because at that point you just basically turn everyone in the Russian elite into an automatic enemy of the West because they've basically said, well, they're on the there's no point in me actually trying to change policy because I'm going to lose what's out there regardless of what I do. So you don't change behavior at all. You essentially just impose a penalty. And it's not clear to me what the point of that penalty is because at least some of the wealth that's obtained in Russia was obtained through lawful businesses. And I don't think there's much of an effort to figure out, who obtained their wealth in ways that we would appreciate from the Western side, who is just as morally righteous a billionaire as some of the US billionaires. There's not any real effort to do that. It's just basically if you have X amount of money in Russia, you're viewed as a Russian oligarch. And while, I can understand that from a putting pressure on Putin standpoint, this notion that you would um, penalize everyone with such a broad brush. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of people you could make the case for penalizing and who've engaged in potentially criminal activity, but that's not what anybody's looking for. They're just kind of painting with such a broad brush that it is hard to understand from a culpability standpoint why you'd impose penalties automatically without more of a finding than just this person is Russian and they have a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the issue is it sounds so fair, right? To take the money of these extremely rich people that are
Right.
so closely tied to such a bad government, right? Which is invading a foreign country.
Yep.
And I think just the problem with this fairness feeling, at the end of the day, whoever the person is, he will have the right to challenge that at the constitutional court in the US, in Germany, in Paris. And at these constitutional court level, the decision will be taken whether there was sufficient criminal activities to warrant such a forfeiture.
Right.
And I think that's really also, if you look at the Ukrainian side, I think it's also difficult then imagine if the West starts to say, okay, we will give you all this money that we seize from Russia, and then at the end of the day, it all falls apart because the legal challenges all of a sudden are successful. Well, then I think that won't be helpful for Ukraine as well, right? So I think
Right.
I think we need to have this debate whether that's possible or not before promising any huge sums to Ukraine, right?
Exactly. A more realistic debate about it, and because I think it's very satisfying to tell voters, well, we're going to support Ukraine and you won't have to pay for it. We're going to make the Russians pay for it. And I understand that sentiment. I mean, and again, I mean, what I was saying before about Russian businessmen, I'm not trying to come out and say, I wasn't pro oligarch. I was just pro due process at this point. It was more of a, if you're going to punish people, you really ought to prove things about those people that go beyond just their wealth and their nationality. But I think when it comes to paying for what's going on in Ukraine, it certainly seems like an ideal solution to have Russia pay for it, but actually making that happen may not be a very realistic promise either over there or over here.
I mean, that's the overall public international law approach, right? That if you are an aggressor, then you need to pay for what you've done wrong,
Yeah.
right? The problem is, at the end of the day, even though it's certainly at least in a political debate, you're not allowed to say that we will have a negotiated solution at some point in time. But if you look at all the recent wars, have always been solved, at the negotiation table. So I hope that someday this will also be possible for this horrible war.
Yes.
And then you will have a settlement, I guess, also financially on what damages are paid.
Right. And to be clear, I mean, Russia should pay, but actually figuring out how to make that happen is very difficult, I think.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been incredibly interesting, Roland. I'm going to give you a shot at any last words, but I think it's been a pretty monumental year for German sanctions, and I really appreciate you coming on the podcast to explain it.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's been very nice talking to you, and let's see how this year goes. We hope it will end without sanctions, because this would mean that the war is over, right?
100% agree.
Yeah.
Stay sanctions free, everybody. Thanks a lot for listening.
Produced by Heartcast Media.